Right now, you can feel that Ukraine is gaining political momentum, but having all of the political sway in the world does not matter if you do not have the proper logistics. Let's talk about it, Tomahawk style. Yes, Tomahawks are in the news. The missile is a long-range strike option available to the United States, and perhaps soon Ukraine as well. You see, the sequence of events featuring first Russia doing basically nothing of consequence following the Alaska summit, then Ukraine lighting on fire basically every Russian oil refinery in striking distance, then Russian drones finding their way into Poland, then Russian drones finding their way into Poland and Romania, then Russian MiG-31s finding their way into Estonian airspace, led to a Trump-Zelensky meeting at the United Nations, where Trump signaled interest in Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, which others in his administration echoed over the following few days. Tomahawks have become the central focus because of their proven track record and ability to rapidly cover huge distances. But in a recurring problem for this war, one does not simply give military aid, or Tomahawks in this case specifically. Indeed, today I want to discuss two significant problems with the plan: how Ukraine would actually fire them, and the escalation concerns that are already a part of the conversation. They are solvable, but they will take some effort. However, let's first ground this in the background of the United States authorizing U.S. weapons use in Russia. The frustrations in Kyiv on this subject began almost immediately after the invasion. The Biden administration offered ample aid to Ukraine, but it came with the restriction that none of it could be fired over internationally recognized Russia. With few exceptions, that policy remained for more than 2.5 years. We did not see a reversal until November 2024, after the Democrats lost the presidential election. U.S. weapons striking Russian soil was always a bit of a red line for the Kremlin, which is an interesting juxtaposition, given that signatures on these pages made the 4 eastern oblasts of Ukraine a part of the Russian Federation by Federation law. Yet the Kremlin was willing to overlook those strikes. Good luck trying to square that circle. In any case, Biden wagered that the Kremlin would likely accept the change in policy, expecting that Trump would cancel it upon coming into office, and that doing anything extreme in the interim might jeopardize that expectation. Well, Trump came into office and did just that. So really, this has been the status quo policy of the war for all but 2 months. And even as all of those incursions were happening in Europe, the online chatter was convinced that Trump was doing nothing, or worse. Let me give you an anecdote of what I mean. The Estonian airspace violation occurred on September 19th. The next morning, a news-ish organization tweeted, "The Pentagon informs European diplomats the U.S. will partially halt military assistance to Baltic nations and NATO states bordering Russia," citing Reuters. I have blurred out the name of the organization because it does not seem to have any independent ability to produce news, and might not even actually be an organization at all. And I need to stress that whenever you see a social media post that cites a real news agency, but does not provide a direct link to the source, your alarm bells should be going off. I found the entire thing suspicious. Trump likes the NATO eastern flank, so this would be a very weird time to announce such a thing. Consequently, I did a little bit of detective work and discovered that Reuters had in fact issued that report on September 5th. It was part of the regularly scheduled Indo-Pacific pivot. Breaking news, this was not. But the tweet had already gone viral. Damage done. Soon, it was going out to other news accounts. It was at the top of r/World News, and we even had a U.S. representative commenting on it. And it will not surprise you that no one in the comments or replies was doing due diligence. Moral of the story? Be a better consumer of news. By actually reading the news from its source. That is where today's returning sponsor, Ground News, comes into play. They will fill your feed with information on the topics that you care about, without the clutter of deliberately misleading social media accounts trying to game an algorithm. And by going to ground.news/lines on maps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a great 40% off their Vantage plan. That gives you unlimited access to this feature and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Digging deeper into the early September cuts, the United States was ending training funds for all of Europe. It just so happens that the eastern flank is disproportionately affected because, well, they are on the eastern flank. Whether that was a good idea at the time is a preference-based judgment call, in part determined by how much one cares about the PRC threat far to the east versus what is happening in Europe. Certainly, we have discussed this trade-off, spearheaded by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Bridge Colby, ad nauseum. But this was by no means deliberate disregard by the Trump administration to the ongoing Russian power play. Now, was it evidence that a retrospective mistake was made at the beginning of the month? Yeah, perhaps. Either way, by the time the UN summit had rolled around, Trump had shifted to a very different public tone, and not just on his now strong preference on taking elevators versus riding escalators. And that is how we got to the speculation surrounding Tomahawks. With that, it is time to get into the complexities of the Tomahawk situation. Zelensky is lobbying hard for them, and the reasons why are straightforward. Tomahawks come in a variety of specifications. The longest range version can fly as far as 2,500 kilometers. Rumors about Ukraine's allotment vary, but suppose they will be the 1,500-kilometer edition instead. Okay, let's map that radius, fired from central Ukraine. And go. Yep, everything of political importance is covered. For a point of reference, Moscow seems close by Tomahawk standards. For a comparison, ATACMS rockets fired from a HIMARS have a quaint range of 500 kilometers. Oh, and remember that number for later. It will be important. In any case, a 1,500-kilometer range opens up, say, a bunch of oil refineries that Ukraine could also knock offline. I know Ukraine's track record since August has been impressive in its own right, but there is always room for more damage with an assist from the United States. Actually, this is notable because the Biden administration hated Kyiv's strategy here, but Trump has sometimes offered enthusiastic support for it. See my recent video on the new intelligence sharing initiative between the United States and Ukraine. Tomahawks also offer more explosive power than the drones that Ukraine has been using for the refinery campaign. Thus far, the refineries have provided most of the explosive capacity, with the drones effectively lighting the fuse. But with a Tomahawk, you do not need a flammable target to cause significant damage. You could instead hit a drone factory, which I am sure that Europe will lobby hard for. And remember, Europe will be paying for the shipments via the Pearl Initiative, so Europe may indeed have some sway there. There has also been some talk that Flamingo missiles may overlap with the missions meant for Tomahawks. Maybe, but more is better than less. Plus, we know that Tomahawks work. Flamingo is still an unproven system. Never mind that Tomahawks are certainly more accurate. Flamingo also appears to be an easier target to shoot down, though US intelligence sharing on how to avoid Russian defenses mitigates that. Either way, Tomahawks do something new, so Ukraine gets a clear benefit if it can use them. You may be detecting a but coming. Well, here it is. But it is unclear how Ukraine would actually fire one of them. You cannot just deliver a Tomahawk to a country like Ukraine and expect it to blow up something. That may sound strange, so let me give you an example that you are already familiar with. The missile that launches and hits a target? That is an ATACMS. A HIMARS is the launch platform, which in this case is a very expensive and oddly designed truck. If the United States just handed Ukraine a bunch of ATACMS, the military brass might think that they are really cool, but they would serve no practical purpose. Likewise, the United States cannot just give Ukraine some Tomahawks. They would also look cool, but do nothing. Okay, The obvious follow-up question is why not give Ukraine some of the launch systems too? Well, let me show you the rest of the image. Yep, it is not a truck. You see, the standard ways that the United States fires Tomahawks are from submarines and large surface ships. Ukraine may have sunk the Moskva, but it still has no navy. It is in no position to take over either of those types of vessels, and nor is the United States in the position to sell either. Your next question might be, how did the United States get into a position where the only way that it can deliver a Tomahawk is via seaway? And my answer to you would be, blame the Soviet Union. Backstory time. In 1987, US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It banned ground-based missile launchers ranging between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Remember how I mentioned that ATACMS can go up to 500 kilometers? Well, that is why. Above 500 would have violated the treaty. On the surface, the treaty was a cost-savings measure. It is better for neither country to pay for the weapons than for both to pay for the weapons. But there was also a more interesting strategic concern. If you put a nuclear weapon on an intermediate-range missile, there may only be 5 to 10 minutes between launch and detonation. This presents your opponent with precious little time to identify the missile, verify its trajectory, relay the situation up the chain of command, and devise a response. Now, that might sound like a really awesome feature of a nuclear weapon if you are going to be the one who fires it, which would make it near irresistible for countries to develop. But I assure you that it is not nearly that awesome. Let's imagine that you have a large arsenal of nuclear-tipped intermediate-range missiles. Well, one thing that you might want to do with them is strike all of your opponent's nuclear weapons. Once your rival is atomicless, you can coerce them to your heart's content, assuming that you can get away with this first strike. Okay, but put yourself in your opponent's shoes. Their radars are detecting incoming missiles, perhaps aimed at nuclear silos. You can see why the opponent might get an itchy trigger finger. The siloed nuclear weapons are in a use them or lose them position, and so the opponent may very well use them. Congrats, you just got nuked. Oh, but I forgot to mention, your opponent's radars were malfunctioning. There were no incoming missiles. Or maybe there were some minor conventional missiles aimed at a militant group leader hiding in the country, and not something worth a nuclear retaliation. Either way, it does not matter. Your opponent just nuked you. You are dead. There is a solution to this problem, though. Just get rid of all of your intermediate-range missiles. If you do not have any, there cannot be any room for misinterpretation. You will still retain your intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those, in contrast, might give a half an hour advanced warning. It is possible they will still cause problems, but the longer warning times reduce the chances. Sea-launched missiles were not covered under the treaty because they were not as omnipresent, and their corresponding verification measures would have been more difficult. Hence, the United States ditched its BMG-109G Griffins, which were land-based Tomahawk launchers, but they were also for nuclear-tipped Tomahawks. But the United States kept the Mark 41 vertical launching system. That is what you saw propel those Tomahawks from earlier. However, the story does not end there. In 2019, the United States withdrew from the treaty, citing Russia's own violations and the fact that China, by that point the United States' pacing threat, was not a party to it. The DoD immediately started experimenting with a land-based option. They started by asking the question, what if you took a Mark 41, stood it upright on a trailer, and launched a Tomahawk? The answer is that it would work just fine. In the intervening years, the United States produced the Typhoon missile system, which answered the slightly different question of, what if you took a standard 40-foot shipping container, put a Mark 41 inside of it, attached it to a towing vehicle, and called it a day, and then did not bother to even film the prototype in high definition? The answer, again, is something that works. It does not have the mobility of HIMARS, but that is irrelevant if you can shoot from way behind the front lines. And when you are firing Tomahawks, you can. Bear in mind, though, that these literally did not exist when the special military operation began. It is not publicly known exactly how many of these have been produced, and whether there is a pool of them sitting somewhere that could be shipped express to Ukraine. In fact, these images are from training exercises in Japan from less than a month ago. If you want to get a good idea of just how new the system is, searching Typhon in the DoD media archives leaves you with a bunch of images of typhoon damage, thanks to the uploader having misspelled the weather phenomenon. There is also a problem with the Tomahawks themselves, or at least the quantity of them. They are not overflowing in the Pentagon's warehouses. Far from it. Indeed, the United States is trying to massively expand production of them, though perhaps that decision should have come sooner. Regardless, this is part of the Indo-Pacific pivot. You could imagine how having a long-range missile might be helpful for hitting Chinese ports as the PRC tries to convoy over to Taiwan. As it stands, the artist formerly known as PACCOM throws a fit every time CENTCOM uses a Tomahawk, say to strike Iranian nuclear facilities. One can only imagine how they will feel if EUCOM starts getting into the action by Ukrainian proxy. So if Ukraine does end up with a collection of Tomahawks, perhaps bet on a small supply for the time being. Use bombs wisely. The logistics problem out of the way, we can now discuss the escalation situation regarding Russia. And, mercifully, this section will be shorter. Moscow's reaction to the Tomahawk discussion has been the usual mutually contradictory posturing. Don't do it, or else. This is an unacceptable escalation. There will be consequences. But simultaneously, Tomahawks will not change the fundamental dynamics of the war. Well, pick one. It is not an escalation if it will not have a tangible effect on the war. My personal favorite call from Moscow has been to deliver Oreshnik missiles to Venezuela, as if Trump were looking for an excuse to invade the country. Not that I need to indulge in the fanfic of a Venezuelan missile crisis, but Russia is in no position to provide serious material support to Venezuela. Maduro knows this, and also knows that the first movement of Russian missiles into his country will result in an American invasion. Internalizing that possibility, he would refuse the deliveries. And it turns out that Russia cannot try to punish the United States in this manner without Venezuelan support. Still, any Tomahawk attack on Russia would implicate a whole bunch of countries within the Western coalition. Obviously, the United States is included for providing the weapons and probably targeting and guidance assistance. But so is any European country that fronted the money to purchase the weapons. I suppose those countries can take some comfort in knowing that the risk is spread out among them, but that risk is unavoidable. I do not imagine Russian ground troops strolling into the Baltics as a punishment, of course. Moscow does not have the capacity to do that. But Russia has been quite active with various gray zone activities, and there is probably some room to expand on those. One way to force Russia to think twice about retaliating further is to limit Ukraine's use of Tomahawks to a handful of select sites. You do not want, for example, Kyiv doing something crazy and launching them at the Kremlin. Instead, step one would be to give Ukraine the green light to hit drone production facilities, one connected to the Garan decoys that floated over Ukraine, and two to the smaller ones that floated over Copenhagen. Step 2 is to publicly, loudly, and explicitly declare that any further action from Russia will result in further targeting of the associated origin sites. The message is clear. If you involve NATO countries in this mess, NATO countries will empower Ukraine to eradicate that Russian capacity. This threat does not just push back on the problem facing NATO countries. Attacking those facilities has the side effect of damaging Russia's ability to continue fighting in Ukraine. So if the Kremlin wants to continue its invasion, then it is not in its best interest to have the conflict spill across the border. That is how you reestablish deterrence without risking nuclear Armageddon. On that happy note, thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan. With any luck, you will see happier news there than something about the impending apocalypse. Meanwhile, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.